Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar delivered by the ISM Trust. I'm John Holmes, ABRSM Chief Examiner. But just before we begin, a few technical points. You can't see us, but you should be able to see the PowerPoint presentation displayed on your screen. You should also be able to hear me, but I can't hear you. If you experience any technical difficulties, such as sound quality or other issues, please let us know in the question box, and we'll make attempts to resolve things at this end. If you have any questions for me relating to the webinar subject or anything else to do with ABRSM, please type them in the questions box and we'll answer as many as possible at the end of this presentation. So the webinar is also being recorded and will be available to view on the ISM's website at ism.org/webinars. It's also worth saying that this material and other support resources are available on the ABRSM website at www.abrsm.org/teacher-support, but I'll mention that again at the end. So I hope you're sitting comfortably with your cup of tea in one hand and digestive biscuit in the other, ready to go. What I want to do is introduce the ABRSM assessment process, giving it a bit of context and filling in some of the gaps that I know from previous experience are often quite helpful to talk about. But first of all, let's put on screen the ABRSM mission, and perhaps the most helpful thing is to give you a moment to read that, because it's really annoying when somebody's talking and you're trying to read. So I'll just let you read through that. So the point here being that our mission is to inspire musical achievement, and that ABRSM offers various pathways and resources in order to do this. I think most people know ABRSM through our exams, but that's not the whole story. In fact, ABRSM provides a range of resources for the support of our mission. And our core offer involves not only assessments, but publications. Many people know us through the ABRSM publications, digital resources as well, opportunities like this, in a sense, teacher CPD, face-to-face and online, and more broadly, advocacy for music education generally. So the point here to make is that it's not all about exams. ABRSM is involved in all dimensions of the musical education landscape. First up, it might be helpful just to summarize, to be clear that we're all on the same page, what ABRSM's assessment offer does consist of. And our graded offer starts actually with the prep test, and then we have the familiar graded exams from 1 to 8, practical and theory. Alongside those, we also have jazz exams, perhaps less well known, grades 1 to 5. These involve improvisation in each section of the exam and are really very different. They're not jazzy, they are genuinely jazz exams. We also have performance diplomas beyond grade 8, starting with the Associate of the Royal Schools of Music, the ARSM, then the Diploma, DIP, ABRSM, Licentiate, LRSM, and finally the Fellowship, FRSM. So there's a diploma suite beyond the grades. And following from that, we also have music direction diplomas at those same 3 levels, DIP, LR, and FR, for those who are wanting to develop their skills in musical direction. Kind of wrapping around that, we have something that's not so well known, performance assessment, which isn't pegged to a grade or an achievement level. It's designed as the opportunity, in a sense, from the candidate's point of view, the applicant's point of view, to say to the examiner what they want from it. You know, I may be thinking of taking a grade. Is my achievement level appropriate? I'm thinking of taking a diploma. I want a bit of feedback. A very useful assessment, which isn't pass-fail, no marks, but intended to be an opportunity for feedback from an ABRSM examiner. It's worth saying also that jazz grade 5 is the equivalent of theory grade 5 in terms of progression beyond our grade 5 exams, so it gives you access to grades 6, 7 and 8, something that not everybody knows either. Around that we have some group teaching awards called our music medals. They broadly go from the sort of prep test level round to about grade 3. That's the meaning of that indicator there. And we also have ensemble exams and choral singing exams at 3 levels, which span around the kind of grades 1 to 8 in the same sort of way, designed for group teaching, group music making. Furthermore, we have teaching diplomas, might be more relevant to some of you listening, again at DIP, LR and FR levels. And I suppose, in a sense, what's happening today, going around all of that, we provide teacher support, events and resources, and more detail about those could be found on the website through the address that I mentioned before. So I just wanted to be clear that the offer, even if we are talking about the assessments, the offer is fairly broad in and of itself. I want to talk about whereabouts we see exams sitting in the kind of firmament of music and learning. And the answer is, of course, that exams are only part of a rich, what I call a curriculum of music making, a constellation of activities. Here we go with school curriculum lessons, instrument or singing lessons, perhaps one-to-one, perhaps small group. Listening to music, this is something that's easier than it's ever been. Learners, old and young, can dial up on Spotify or other similar resources, any piece, anytime, anywhere. So listening to music has become something much more accessible than it perhaps used to be. Going to live concerts, composing and improvising, and that could mean jamming with your mates at the weekend, or it could mean formal composing for perhaps school music exams, things like that, and of course improvisation with that. Ensemble music making, singing and playing with others, all of these are very much part, we see these very much as part of a correct and sort of full musical range of activities. And exams play a part in that. They're not an end in themselves, they are a means to an end. And kind of by analogue, they're there at 11 o'clock on the dial. There should be something that is part of the picture, but they're definitely not the be-all and end-all. And as an exam awarding organisation, we don't see exams as an end in themselves. They should be a means to an end. I think some people are quite surprised to hear the Chief Examiner of ABRSM saying that, but there it is, official. You've heard it direct. Let's think about another way of looking at the role and the place of assessment in music teaching and learning. And this is deliberately one of those diagrams where it doesn't really start or finish anywhere. It's a circle. It's a positive, connected cycle of events. So let's start with motivation. Want to learn an instrument, want to take up, say, the violin, have lessons, do some learning, progress, get better, get to a certain stage, attainment. You get to a point where you've reached a level. How do you know? How do you kind of measure your progress? What do you aim for? Well, often an assessment is a way of marking that, and a well-designed and positive assessment will then in turn provide motivation, and the motivation will spur further progression and so on. So we have a kind of positive cycle of reinforcement. I mean, I often think of this in terms of some of these shows that we see on TV, the elimination shows, think Bake Off or The Apprentice or anything like that. And what you often find people saying after one episode, whether they've got through or not, is sort of, I've got this far, I didn't realise I'd be doing this well. I feel so motivated. I'm going to redouble my efforts to make sure that I really make it. In a sense, the assessment, you're through to the next stage, gives the motivation. I really want to do this now. I'm taking this even more seriously than I was before. That spurs progression. I'm going to work on my work, attainment. Then you end up at a higher level. So this idea that assessment plays a part in a cycle of positive reinforcement. Another way of looking at it, perhaps, is through our, well, it's kind of a sausage machine here, I guess that's what it's often been called. Starting on the left-hand side, we've got the idea of, a piece of music or a performance has a set of, it calls for a set of requirements. You've got to be able to do things, and in order to deliver those requirements, you need skills, knowledge, and understanding. Those 3 words, obviously familiar, very often put together in terms of the music curriculum and others, skills, knowledge, and understanding. And in this case, perhaps of the performer of the music. Those 2 things, kind of put them in the machine and add another vital ingredient, teaching and learning along the way. And in a sense, the Assessment is what comes out of the end, what we might call the musical outcome. And one of the main points to make about the ABRSM assessment is that we focus on the musical outcome. We can't look into a crystal ball and gaze into the future and talk about promise. All we've got to go on is the snapshot on the day. Equally, we can't look back in the past and say, well, you've worked really hard for this, therefore, or for you, this is a really good attainment, or actually this doesn't match what you've done. We don't have a contextual past or future. We're just listening to and assessing the musical outcome, which, as you can see, is another way of thinking about the combination of these ingredients you see on screen. So let's think about the place and the role of assessment in musical progression. I mean, how does it function? Formative assessment being assessment for learning, the kind of dialogue that you would typically hear in a lesson, school lesson or an instrument lesson, blah, 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 I've done this, here's some feedback, and now what I want to see next week, what I want you to try hard on this week is X, Y, and Z. That's assessment for learning, in the sense I've looked at your strengths and weaknesses, I've identified some development areas, here are the tools to get better, let's make sure that's what happens for next week. Formative assessment, week on week, kind of term upon term, year upon year. And that enables the growth and development of skills, knowledge, and understanding. Skill building, knowledge building, understanding building, through formative assessment and the teaching and learning process. That leads to, going back to our positive cycle, attainment, getting better, reaching a stage of skill level, knowledge level, understanding that's higher than it was before. The idea of summative assessment, assessment of learning, the snapshot that I was talking about just now, the idea of that is that becomes motivational. So periodically, a summative assessment says, yes, I can confirm that you've got to this stage. You've shown through demonstration, managing various tasks and tests, you've got that level, and we can give you a certificate. And as I said, often that can provide the motivation to get to the next stage. So in a sense, that diagram that you now see in front of you is a kind of representation of the correct role of both summative and formative assessment in the musical progression process. Another very important thing I want to say is that the ABRSM examiner is on your side. I know because I train all the examiners, and ever since I've been chief examiner, starting in 2010, I've been at every examiner training event, and I make it very clear that the message you see on screen in front of you, I'll do my best to help you do your best, is at the heart of everything we do in the exam room, from saying a friendly greeting to candidates, to making sure that they're comfortable with the height of the stool or the positioning of the stand or whatever it may be before they start, to the way that we play the oral tests, to the clarity with which we ask the scales, and so on and so forth. But it's become clear to me since I made that very much the mantra, the ABRSM examiner mantra, that in fact if we elevate this to other levels, in a sense that's what we want to do as teachers. The teacher's mantra is I'll do my best to help you do your best. And ABRSM's role, in a sense, in turn, is to enable its examiners to do their best. The organisation should be doing its best to help them do theirs. So in a sense, I've got to the place now where I feel that this applies in lots of contexts and at different levels. But I did want to make the point that the examiner is there to enable the candidate to do their best. And I say to examiners, it's all very well marking criteria, it's all very well delivering the right scales and the oral tests and so on, but if you don't have the correct dynamic in the room, if you're not enabling the candidate to do their best by your manner and the way that you are running the room, then in fact the marks are wrong already, because you're not listening to the performance as it would normally be. It's been undermined to some extent already. So this is first and foremost, and I wanted to make that point strongly. A lot of people think that there is a kind of template, idealized way of playing, which would attract lots of marks in assessment, but that's actually not the case. And we all know, for example, that there are dozens of recordings of our favorite piece, and that's because there are all sorts of different approaches and interpretations, all of which are valid. there isn't actually an ABRSM way to play or to sing. And there isn't an ABRSM way to teach either. There are all sorts of routes and pathways to achievement. But what I am here to talk about a bit more detail is that there is an ABRSM way to assess performance. And that's what I'm going on to talk about now. So let's think first of all about what is assessment, what are its fundamental ingredients. Well, I've already mentioned the two species with which I'm sure many of you are familiar, formative assessment and summative assessment. Formative assessment, you can see on the left, kind of assessment in the teaching context, assessment for learning, whereas on the right, you can see me examining a piano candidate, assessment of learning. And just to, let's unpack those a little bit. First of all, think about the examining type of assessment, summative assessment. It's a snapshot on the day. I've said that already. The only input, the only evidence which the assessment has to go on is what is seen and heard on the day, the musical outcome on the day. It's a generalist assessment. It doesn't rely on instrument specialism. It's a generalist approach. I'll be talking a little bit more about that later. Typically, with summative assessment, feedback is written and it tends to arrive later. Think other types of exam, GCSEs, A-levels and so on. You wait for the feedback. The focus is on the outcome. It can only be predicated on the evidence such as it is during the exam, be that written in a GCSE or, in this case, heard and seen. And it's a one-off independent assessment. It doesn't have the context of knowing the student. It doesn't, it's not informed in any way by previous knowledge. Let's flip that round to the other side of teaching assessment, formative assessment. There are some commonalities here, but some differences. Formative assessment evolves over time. It relies on information about the student or the group of pupils which comes from the past and heads into the future. It is specialist. Typically, the sort of lessons that you're seeing on screen in front of you involves discussion of breathing or finger placement or other aspects of technique. It's subject specific. The feedback tends to be verbal, primarily. Okay, there may be end of term reports and things, but primarily formative assessment involves immediate feedback. Have another go, try this time I want you to move your fingers here, or this time we're going to do that phrase again, we really want a crescendo that goes, whatever it may be. And the focus is on the means by which it gets there, the technical means, the craft, can we call it, of the instrument. This is the way to do it, now I want you to try again. And a characteristic of formative assessment is it tends to be long-term. It's not a snapshot. It plays out over time. This could be certainly terms, if not years, and it does have the insight of individual context, the individual student or that particular class, and the broad span of the trends and patterns of the work, the teaching and learning. So now that we've kind of established the differences between those two species of assessment, let's just think about, okay, well, we see how summative assessment works, we see how the assessment in an exam situation functions, but okay, what do we measure? What are the right things to assess? Well, I often think of the primary colours of assessment, if we can call them that. Let's just think about the language of music. I mean, people often call music a language. What are the primary core skills of a language? I think most people would agree that speaking and listening, we're thinking kind of almost national curriculum terminology here, reading and writing, and knowing and understanding. And most of us would find it easy to sign up to a sort of, what are the core skills, what are the primary colours of a language? Those are they. So let's now translate that into the language of music. What does that look like? Well, speaking and listening, performing and listening. Reading and writing, well, reading and writing music. And knowing and understanding, well, knowing and understanding how music works. And of course, there's a whole raft of other aspects of musical activity, and I've just got a few on screen here for you. But if you like, these are not primary colours. They involve a combination of the other core skills. So let's take one at random, for example. What about playing in an ensemble? Well, in order to play in an ensemble, you need to be able to play your instrument or sing, but you probably also need to be able to read music. You need to be able to respond to a common score that everyone else is working from. And to some extent, you probably need a bit of knowledge and understanding about how music works, how the time is going to work in terms of keeping together, what the conductor signals. There needs to be some element of knowing and understanding. Whereas, for example, let's call talking about music kind of what I'm doing a bit at the moment. Again, you don't particularly need to be able to play your instrument to talk about music, but you do need knowledge and understanding, and you probably will need to have read and possibly written about music. So all the others in the smaller segments here are what we might call hybrids or compounds of the core skills. And what I'm getting round to saying is that if that's so, we don't necessarily need an improvising section and a composing section and an transposing section in all tests. We can actually focus on testing the core skills, and that kind of covers it. And that's very much the ABRSM approach. Nobody takes up the clarinet so that they can do sight reading. Nobody takes up the piano so that they can practice oral tests. They take up these instruments, we all did, in order to sing or play, to perform. And that's why that box is at the top of the screen. Musical performance, interpretation, communication, this magical combination of combining the art and craft of music making. But underneath, supporting those, whether we like it or not, whether we want to do scales, for example, are part of the development of technical skills. They give us a physical geography of the instrument. They make us more aware of key and patterns and things like that. We need notation skills if we're to be able to join in with others or play music written by others. Notation skills are in there. They're not the be-all and end-all. They're not a deal breaker or maker necessarily, but they are definitely a supporting skill. They enable you to recognize things instead of having to read them every time. They enable you to keep going, and they enable you to realize musical detail and a whole load of other things too. And similarly with listening skills, you can see on screen, why do we need listening skills? They enable performing skills. And this maps to other areas of activity too. I mean, think, sport, think soccer. I mean, I used to teach a lot of boys, and they always wanted to kind of be the goal scorer. That's what they wanted to play. That's why they wanted to play football, wanted to score the goals. But of course, you can't do that unless you're fit, unless you can keep going for the full length of the match. You can't score a valid goal unless you understand what offside is. You can't, because it will be disallowed. And similarly, you need to understand the kind of listening skills, the equivalent. You need to understand team skills rather than thinking that it's the me show. It has to be a team effort, and it's actually quicker to pass the ball to somebody else than it is to run with it, and things like that. So just in the same way, there are a raft of supporting skills that are needed for the aim in sight of performing skills. And underpinning the whole lot is about knowing and understanding. So if we transform these, I'll just sort of go back one. Performing skills maps to the interrelated tests that we have in an ABRSM, which support the assessment. For performance, we have 3 pieces or songs. For the technical skills, we map that to a task, which involves playing scales and arpeggios or an unaccompanied song if it's singing. And similarly, for notation skills, it's not that we advocate necessarily sight reading per se, but sight reading as a test is a very good way of measuring, of assessing notation skills, reading skills. And oral tests are a very good way, non-instrument specific way of assessing listening skills. And of course, underneath all of that, the music theory exam is designed to assess, to measure the identifying skills, explaining and analyzing, recognition, those kind of things. So what I'm hoping to do there is to connect the design of the ABRSM exam assessment, 6 sections, to connect that to what are the important things to assess. It's not to say it's the only way to do it. It is a way of making sure that the core skills are at the heart of the assessment and that you take a broad-based assessment of all of them. Thinking about performing, playing, this is an area where, perhaps above all, we need to combine the subjective with the objective. And a big question about assessment is, how do you do that? How do you assess musical performance? What are you measuring? What are the yardsticks? Well, let's just think about our 5 senses generally, because this is the way that we measure things every day, all day, for our whole lives. We use our five senses to kind of navigate safely, to cross the road safely, to pick something up, and determine whether it's too hot to touch or not. You can think of all sorts of examples for yourself, right down to, is the milk safe to pour on your cornflakes? That's a taste and a smell. We need these five senses to adjudicate and navigate safely through life. Well, in an analogous way, the ABRSM exam assessment uses the five senses of music making to arrive at a safe assessment of musical performance. Sense of pitch, sense of time, sense of tone, sense of shape, we often talk about that. And of course, we always use the term sense of performance. Come out of a concert, raving about how wonderful it was, what an amazing sense of performance, how communicative, the energy, the commitment, those kind of things. So these are the senses of music making, and these are the ways, the lenses, if you like, through which ABRSM exams assess music making. And just to unpack those in a bit more detail, here they are. Of course, pitch is everything to do with up and down, A and B, F and F sharp, sharp, flat, all those dimensions of music which are to do with pitch and pitching. Time is everything that you could clap, so it's about tempo, stability of pulse, rhythm, values, and so on. Sense of tone, so this is the voice, the particular voice of the instrument, the sound that's made. And it's not just about the intrinsic qualities, it's also about the way they're deployed, sensitivity and awareness in using them. Sense of tone. Sense of shape is often hidden to view. If you look at a piece of Bach, for example, Baroque music, there's nothing on the music, no clues to give us a sense of which direction phrases are heading in or what to bring out or where there's points of intensity and points of repose. It has to be inferred from the music. And of course, there's other music where those details are very clear and explicit. But shape, sense of shape, is about bringing from the music those aspects which are to do with direction, line, repose, intensity, heading forward, heading back, shaping and detail. And the sense of performance, kind of three things really. You and your instrument, your command of the vehicle, can we call it? The violin or the organ or the guitar or whatever it may be, the human voice, your command. You and your music, so that's about the interpretative dimensions. You and your understanding of that piece, making it sound how it should sound with its particular characteristics. And of course, in performance terms, most important, you and your audience. You and communicating outwards. And in an exam, a metaphor for the audience is the examiner, but it's very important to have someone to perform to. That's about musical communication. I want to talk briefly about consistency because this connects with what we've been saying. Is it a music exam? Or is it say a clarinet exam or a piano exam? Well, the answer is ABRSM exams are first and foremost music exams. We focus on the musical outcome, not the way it got there. So typically, an examiner wouldn't be saying the fingering wasn't ideal. Thinking about the piano, it should have been this. What they would say is the outcome of the fingering. So that would be along the lines of technical delivery wasn't always even or regular, or there were some unwarranted notes sticking out from the phrase where they should have been even within it. And we use criteria which are non-instrument specific, so that enables examiners to be consistent in assessing all the instruments, rather than suggesting that we bring any particular instrumental expertise to bear when we're examining all the instruments, because that would introduce unevenness and a bias, inconsistency. So consistency is very tightly connected to the generalist approach. We have other mechanisms in place to make sure that examiners' assessment is consistent. Every examiner is moderated between 2 and 3 years, regularly every 2 to 3 years, and in between those moderations we spot check a group of mark forms, and a report based on those is sent back to the examiner again every couple of years. Every year we have a program of continuing professional development conferences, seminars for all examiners, and we also provide marking statistics every year to examiners so that they themselves can understand the correlation between their marking and the national average picture, and that goes into quite some detail. There are other types of consistency. Of course, we do need specialists to tell us what are the appropriate scales for, say, the oboe, and what grade 3 sight reading on the harp should look like. You need a harpist to tell you that, or an oboist. We do have specialist syllabus input to make sure that across the different instruments, the requirements are consistent. And we're also able, in terms of time frame, to look back over previous syllabus and lists of requirements to make sure that we are being consistent in terms of what's being set over time. And some of you may be thinking, well, the grade 5 piano list seems much easier to me than it was when I did it. But in fact, we do look back over quite some time periods and make sure that whilst repertoire and style and character move on, and we do need to recognise that, of course, in all our lists, nevertheless, we are mapping the standard of demand, the level of musical demand, across from one time period to the next. Finally, I just want to talk about the different models of marking, because this webinar is about aspects of assessment. And there are 3 that it's worth understanding and it's worth me identifying. One of them is what we might call the deficit-oriented approach, where you take marks off. So you start with a maximum, and you best case scenario, you just end up with what you started with. Think driving tests, for example. You set off in the car, and ideally, you don't do anything wrong and you don't get any penalties. But for every time that you do something unideal, you'll get a minor penalty. And for any time that you do something more major, we won't go into those, it's called a major. And if you get any majors, you automatically fail. There's no kind of subtlety about that, automatic failure for specific things. That's the deficit-oriented model. And I think some people think that the ABRSM assessment is a bit like that. And that sort of misunderstanding is betrayed by questions like, how many marks do you take off if a candidate starts again? Or how many marks go missing if somebody doesn't notice the key signature in the sight reading? There's no answer to that. We don't have that tariff board. There isn't an automatic X deliberately leads to Y. It doesn't happen that way. The opposite of the sort of deficit-oriented model is the from zero, and the typical model of this is the school written exam, GCSE, A-level. You start with a blank sheet of paper. There are questions on one side. You may begin. You pick up your pen, and off you go. And you have to accrue credit. If you don't write anything down, you're not going to get any marks. And every time you write down a correct assertion and you perhaps support it with a reference or something, you accrue ticks in the margin. You get credit. And then there's a kind of totting up of the total of that, and often a reconciliation with a kind of holistic descriptor. The candidate overall has shown this or that or the other. That's a kind of from zero model. Now, neither of these really suit music making. And the ABRSM assessment approach is what you might call diagnostic. Notionally, at least, a candidate starts neither with the maximum nor with the minimum, but on the pass mark. We weigh up strengths and weaknesses kind of dynamically as music goes along. You can't have a model whereby you take a mark off for every wrong note, or you deduct so-and-so for an incorrect rhythm. Music doesn't work like that. We all know that, for example, if something is very out of tune, it doesn't matter how well the other things are going, it fundamentally undermines the music making. So there can't be a kind of specific tariff or weighting for any dimension of the playing or the singing. Think back to the senses, which of your senses is the most important? Which one would you kind of readily do without? We need them all. There are situations where they're all, in their own turn, in their own way, vitally important. And that's true of pitch, time, tone, shape, and performance. So, how do we assess? Well, we identify what happened. It might be a pitch, time, tone, or shape, performance, dimension. We locate, that could be whereabouts in the piece, whereabouts in the instrument, whereabouts in the duration of the music, and we weigh it up. To what extent? How much? This was a small pitch error, or it was slightly out of tune, or it was considerably flat, or the rhythm was really quite unstable, or there were tiny, it's a quantification. So identifying, locating, and quantifying. And this screen is actually quite helpful, I think, for teacher feedback, for formative assessment, because when the students played to us, that's what they're expecting, an analysis of what they did, what happened, and not just bad things, good things as well, of course, whereabouts and to what extent. Play with a beautiful tone. I really like those high notes in the middle. They're sounding a lot better than last week, although we can still work on the roundness of tone. So to finish with, here's a 2-minute extract of somebody playing, and this should, I hope, give you an insight into sort of ABRSM examiner mindset. So whilst this student is playing his Scarlatti sonata, the kind of graphic equalizer of assessment that you see on the right-hand side of the screen will operate. And this is an idea rather than anything that's been very carefully quantified, but just to give you an idea of how we think. And then the comment will write out in the blank space at the bottom, giving you a sense of how we apply the pitch, time, tone, shape, performance criteria in live time whilst the candidate is playing. So I hope this is helpful. So whilst the music is unfolding, we're weighing in the kind of metaphorical balance in our mind, the strengths and the weaknesses, considering them through those perspectives, those angles, those angled lenses. And you can see in a sense how that informs the comment. And the comment should refer to the ingredients of music making that we say we measure. So you'll see there in that comment reference to performance, reference to pitch, reference to shaping, time, tone, and so on. Not necessarily in that order, but giving a sense of the priorities, what we might call the main drivers of what would be a high mark. This is a distinction performance, but there are still no less things to say in terms of weaknesses and strengths that are helpful for the candidate. In fact, that leads me on to the final point, really, that effective assessment has to provide evaluative feedback. I think, back to the driving test, well, what didn't I do so well? What did I do well? What did I not do well? We're not going to tell you. You've just got 4 penalty points. That's it. That doesn't provide evaluative feedback. And to some extent, this is true also of summative exams, such as GCSEs and A-levels. You can call back the papers and things like that. But fundamentally, they're not about providing feedback, giving a diagnosis of the strengths and weaknesses. And being clear there that there's a difference between a diagnosis and a prescription. You go to the doctor and say, here are my various symptoms. Well, I can diagnose that as so-and-so, and what I recommend or what I prescribe now, that's the next stage. Well, in that area, we as assessors stay back, and it's the teacher's job to say what the solution is, what the strategy should be, if you like, what the prescription should be. But the examiner's job is to diagnose the relative pattern of strengths and weaknesses. So the comments on the mark form are vital. They're of vital value to the assessment. They give affirmation of achievement, attainment, if you like, and they should provide the motivation for further progression. And that takes me back to where we started, really. A component of effective assessment, the components here you see are valid. It should measure the right things. It should do it reliably. It shouldn't be anecdotal. It should arrive at a safe verdict. There should be consistency. The measurements should be the same across time, across geography, across examiner team. And vitally, for the progression of the learner, there should be meaningful feedback. And I hope I've demonstrated how those components are all present in the ABRSM exam assessment in a way that balances the need for those things and provides value for the learner. So going back to where we started, I hope you can see that the ABRSM assessment does play its role in the positive cycle, the positive indications there that you've got from one aspect of progression to the next. And as I said at the very beginning, the way that that works is to combine a summative assessment with formative assessment and provide motivation as time goes by. I do hope that's been helpful and it was informative. Very keen to take any questions that there might be. That's the website I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation. And perhaps I should repeat also that the recorded version will be available on the ISM website. That's ism.org/webinars. So thank you very much indeed for joining us. I think we're going to move to questions now. And when you've given me a moment, I'll be able to see them on screen for myself and then start responding to them. I'm going to start with the question from Deborah. Deborah says, why have you changed the singing exams so that memorization is not required? And I'll be honest, Deborah, because I don't really understand the question. You do still have to sing from memory all songs. So I may be misunderstanding your question, but we haven't changed the requirement to sing from memory. It may be that you're referring to ARSM, which is our relatively new performing diploma between grade 8 and DIP ABRSM, where we're saying that in line with the other diplomas, by all means adopt your own convention, and many singers say of oratorio or of more complex contemporary scores would read from music, but the ARSM is all about performance, and we're saying in a sense to candidates, perform in the way that's best for you in order to maximize the communication, the musical communication between you and the examiner. So I hope that helps, but I'm a little bit concerned it might not. James has asked a question which says, what do you look for when recruiting examiners? And I hope perhaps from the presentation that you get a sense that the answer of that is a range of things. Let's think about manner, method, and marking. I mentioned those words earlier on. Manner is about being good in the room, being able to work well with all ages, all stages. It's about being able to some extent, control the room and make the candidate feel reassured, but in a friendly and encouraging way. Method is about organisation, really. It's about making sure that you can run to time, that you can keep a quite busy desk well organised, well controlled, and that you can log things in your mind such that you're not, for example, going to forget any sections of the exam or perhaps sections of the oral tests, whatever it may be. So quite a heavy load of methodology. And then, of course, marking, the third of the M's, manner, method, marking. Marking is about being able to work to criteria, to understand and apply the notion of generalist, non-instrument specific criteria, such as I've been talking about already. And in a sense, the mixture of those three M's is really the multitasking world of examining. And it may be helpful to say that on the ABRSM website, under the Becoming an Examiner tab, we do have a person specification. These are the kind of typical qualities that we are looking for. And we also have a role description. These are the skills and knowledge that you would need to do the job. So anyone who's interested in that, that would be a good place to start. There's also a podcast that I recorded that puts a little flesh on the bones of those other things and explains it in more detail. So I hope that's helpful. Just looking through the remaining questions. I have a question here from Joshua, who says, can we see an example of an assessment before entering students for exams? And the answer is a resounding yes on that. On the ABRSM website, under the teacher support section, or in the teacher support tab, is a set of recorded exams entitled On Your Marks, where you have an opportunity yourself to work through the 6 sections of an exam, to have a go at marking them. And then after each section, there's the opportunity to hear me talking about the way we would have assessed it and giving you an indication of the marking that would have applied in a real exam situation. And a lot of teachers have said to me, I've got some of my students going in for their first grade 1. We had a look at that grade 1 OBO exam that you've got on the web, and it was really reassuring. They understood what to expect much better. So I think there are all sorts of ways that can be used, but certainly, can you see anything like that? Yes, there's a whole range, all the grades, and a good range of instruments there, and also a good range of attainment levels as well. How are we doing, Freya, on time?
We have a few more minutes, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course it is. Just don't want to go on too long. There's another question here, again from Joshua, that says, what is Teaching Notes Live? That's a good question. It's on the screen. I appreciate that, but I haven't really explained that. I said at the very beginning, and do you remember all those circles explaining what the ABRSM offer consists of? I talked about our wish to support teaching and provide teacher support. And in a sense, the answer to that question is Teaching Notes Live is a web-based version of our teacher support, in this case for the piano syllabus and also others, starting at the moment with flutes. So we used to have a book, essentially, that you could get, but what we think is much more useful is to have iterated sort of examples and suggestions and ideas about teaching particular pieces or particular aspects of an instrument. And so it's a compendium, really, a whole range of short teacher support videos that you can listen to and watch free. It's on the website, designed to support teaching. A few of them from me myself, 10 top tips for warming up, this kind of thing, practice tips, more general, non-instrument specific things as well. And this is very much the direction of travel for the organisation, to be in every area doing our very best, as I said on one of the other screens, doing our best to help you do your best. What have you got there, Freya?
So we have a question from Jenna, which says, which age would you feel is most appropriate for a teacher to start encouraging young learners through ABRSM music exams?
What age would be best to start? Do you know? I think the answer to that is no specific age. I mean, we have people from the very earliest to the very latest years coming through our exam door. And I think that's one of the great things about graded musical exams generally. They're not age specific. They are, if you like, musical learning stage specific, but we all know that there's such a thing as returning to learning, and a lot of people, and inspired by BBC, had a program of, get your instrument out of the loft, dust it off and come back to it, sort of thing, last year at the proms. And there isn't really a map which attaches chronological age to grade. And I think the best answer is that the exam should be something. Do you remember my diagram that had the kind of constellation of activities? The exam should come at 11 o'clock. It should be a comfortable fit with whereabouts a candidate is. It shouldn't feel like a struggle or a stretch. It should feel something that's comfortably within reach, that naturally, almost seamlessly, fits into all the other activities that are happening. It shouldn't become an end in itself. It should feel like a means to an end, and I've explained what that end is, which is motivational and affirmatory.
Excellent, thank you. If we take one more question,
sure,
that would be great. So, if we take Merjan's question, hello, would you recommend doing a music theory exam first before the instrument exam, or does it not matter?
I love that question. That's great. And of course, my driving test analogy comes in here because you're not actually allowed to take the driving test until you've done the driving theory test. That's quite a new thing. It's an interesting question. And if you're asking me personally, I guess this is not really ABRSM's view, but I think a good answer is yes. I think it's great to establish the knowledge and understanding, which, as I've explained, I hope in my presentation, that they actually underpin the practical activity. I gave the analogy of the offside rule. You can't be a good goal scorer unless you know and understand something quite academic. It's a rule. Yeah. And similarly with music, I mean, how can you, I'll take an example that's not necessarily at grade 1, but how can you play an imperfect cadence and a perfect cadence? How can you really play them differently if you don't understand what they mean? And in grade 1, there'll be all sorts of things. Like, what's the difference between major and minor? If you don't have a deeper understanding of the workings, the knowledge and understanding that underpin the musical activity, of course you can do it, of course you can take an exam, but it kind of leads to a fragility. It doesn't have that sort of scaffolding foundation underneath. And I think in some countries this happens. For example, in Malaysia we do a lot of exams there, and more typically in Malaysia, candidates will have done the kind of commensurate theory exam before they tackle a practical exam. And I think it's a very good approach to think of them as side by side. And that's very much something that I think, to be honest, I think we've driven people away from that, but particularly saying grade 5 theory is the gateway to the other exams. So people just think, all right, it's all about grade 5, let's cram that. Whereas actually, truthfully, I think each theory exam maps and pegs really nicely to the same grade. So I think implicit in your question, Mirjam, is a really good principle which I sort of support and endorse.
Thank you very, very much, and thank you to everybody for listening today.